against the president. Senators like Bob Corker, Tim Scott questioning not only what he said, but now his stability, his ability to leave, his moral authority, in their words. What is the impact of this as the president is increasingly isolated? Let's bring in CNN political analyst Ron Brownstein and CNN politics reporter and editor-at-large Chris Cillizza. Gentlemen, nice to have you here. Let's take a moment to listen. Good morning. Let's take a moment to listen to Senator Corker, because this is someone who has, taken pains to not call out the president a lot. He was considered possibly for VP, Secretary of State, but he didn't hold back yesterday.
The president has not yet been able to demonstrate the stability nor some of the competence that he needs to demonstrate in order to be successful. He also recently has not demonstrated that he understands the character of this nation.
Chris Cillizza, this was the point in your newsletter last night. That's a big deal, those words.
Yeah, I think they are. I think, Pop, you rightly note the source matters, right? This is not Lindsey Graham or John McCain, both serious senators, but people who have never been even close to Trump fans. This is Bob Corker, someone who has worked hard to keep a line of communication open with this White House. And so when you hear anything critical of Trump from him, I think you pay attention. I think the critique is even more important. This is not about, well, the president says some things that maybe he shouldn't say, right? That was sort of what Lee Zeldin was saying earlier in the show. This is a fundamental questioning of whether the president of the United States is up for the job that he currently holds. Corker uses the word stability twice in that Q&A with reporters. He uses the word competence twice. When a sitting Republican senator who is not a Trump hater questions the stability and competence of the president of the United States, it's, number one, not an accident, and number two, is something we need to pay attention.
But numbers matter, and there are a lot more Zeldins, Ron, than there are Corkers. Lee Zeldin, I said he was burning a lot of calories, not to disrespect the congressman, but just, to give you a profile in the truth there. The idea that, well, yes, dipping bullets in pig's blood and slaughtering Muslims and trying to disrespect their faith while we do it is not an effective mode of anti-terror that we're studying right now. That's about as generous assessment of a BS story and suggestion that you can offer. And there are a lot more people doing that kind of speaking out about the president than what Corker just did. What does that mean?
Well, sure. I mean, look, first of all, the argument from most Republicans that, you hear privately is we can't criticize the president more forcefully while our base is still with him, while our own voters are still with him. As I said in the last hour, if you look historically, that has not been a disqualifying dynamic for earlier generations of leaders. I mean, basically every time when people in Congress have stood up to a president from their own party, from William Fulbright on Vietnam in '66 to the Senate Republicans on Watergate in the '70s, that president was still overwhelmingly popular with voters in their own party. Leadership matters. Leadership can shape public opinion. And I think it's really important for Republicans, in Congress to understand what the trajectory of this administration is. I mean, Steve Bannon, kind of came out of seclusion with emails and comments to several news organizations in the last few days saying, if they want to talk about race every day, we'll win talking about economics. In fact, I would argue to you the sequence is exactly the opposite. It was only after the health care bill and the erosion that created in the president's support among blue-collar and older adults, two cornerstones of his coalition, when he kind of moved away from his promise to protect them economically during the campaign. Only after that have we seen the administration turn sharply right on a series of cultural and racial issues, culminating in Charlottesville. And I think that is what Republicans can probably expect more of in the months and years ahead. And they've got to decide, are they willing to stay on that ride?
And just, Poppy, just quickly to add to the trajectory point, where, if you're a Republican elected official, let's say, where do you think this goes? I mean, I heard someone last night say, well, what's needed, I think it was Jack Kingston, what's needed is that Donald Trump may need, he needs a course correction. This is Donald Trump. He's a 71-year-old man. We now have 2+ years of him as either as a candidate and now as president. The idea that Donald Trump is suddenly going to become someone other than who he is, seems to me a little bit of a fantasy.
And it's not only the personal kind of qualities. There is clearly a political calculation here. Right? Yeah. From the beginning, President Trump and his team have believed that the way to win is to mobilize the elements of the Republican coalition, first in the primary and then in the country, that are the most uneasy about demographic change, whether it's blue collar, older, evangelical, and non-urban whites. And mobilizing that base and feeding that base has been the most consistent political note. And so the question for Republicans is, do they believe that is enough in a diversifying, urbanizing country? It is not only moral, there's a political calculus at work for them as well.
All right, gentlemen. Appreciate it. Thank you for the perspective, as always. You have to say, if nothing else, what we've seen with Charlottesville and what the president said about studying the fake Pershing story, it's very clear what his strategy is and who he's trying to cultivate. Will it work for the country? See. U.S. college basketball teams caught in Spain during that deadly terror attack. How did they fare? What did they do? The details in the Bleacher Report.
Rap really starts to take hold.
Duke and Dr. Dre at the door.
Missy Elliott.
Biggie Small.
President Trump is trying to move away from drawing a moral equivalence between both sides of the violence in Charlottesville and to the issue of Confederate statues and monuments. The president tweeting, "Sad to see the history and culture of our great country being ripped apart with the removal of our beautiful statues and monuments." Remember, the president during the campaign said the Confederate flag should come down and be put away in a museum. So he's changed. Play some politics. Let's discuss the merits. We have Michael Eric Dyson, author of Tears We Cannot Stop, A Sermon to White America, and Al Brophy, law professor at the University of Alabama. Professor Brophy, let's start with you. Keep the statues up because...
I think they're reminders of the bad old days. It's important to remember that once in this country, the people who were in power were supporters of the Confederacy and wanted to keep alive the memory of the war fought to maintain slavery. And I think it's important to remember that history, and those statues are great ways of remembering that history and continuing to have a dialogue about that history.
Michael, counterpoint.
Well, the point is, I understand that. In a neutral atmosphere, that makes sense. In a non-politically charged atmosphere, that would be great. But when those symbols are used to reinforce white supremacy, which has material consequence, empirical consequence, people are dying, people are clashing, people are being hurt, it's endorsing, it's not teaching. Teaching is about the neutral observation of factors that can be considered when we're making an argument about American history. Endorsing suggests that this is a powerful ideal to which we aspire, and as a result of that, those symbols can be used to hurt and harm the very people who would neutrally observe it. So while I understand what the professor is arguing here, in this highly charged moment, this is about America's values and what we're reinforcing to our children and the people who are our citizens.
Professor, is it not relevant when they were put up, the turn of the century, during Jim Crow, almost as an in-your-face reminder that the spirit of the Confederacy, which is a malignancy to the unity of this country, still lived at that time?
I think it's incredibly important when they were put up, and that's, I think, precisely the point. I agree with Professor Dyson's argument that we shouldn't just have the monuments by themselves. We need to do the hard work of interpreting them, and I think the virtue of having monuments there is that people can then ask, well, why is it that somebody put a statue of General Lee up in Charlottesville in 1924? And that allows us, having the monuments up there allows us to have ongoing discussions. Obviously, they need to be contextualized.
But how do you contextualize something that on its face is a celebration?
Sure. Counter monuments is one example. In Talbot, Maryland, there's a statue of Frederick Douglass, who was from the great abolitionist, who's from Talbot, alongside a monument put up in the early 20th century to Confederate soldiers. I think that's exactly the kind of dialogue we want. Look, these statues are almost surely going to come down. There's nothing so powerless as an idea whose time is past. They're going to come down, but I think there's a danger in taking them.
Michael.
Well, I think the danger in leaving them up is even greater. Again, in a neutral atmosphere where we are objective or as fair as possible, the professor's point is salient and cogent. But in the midst of a culture where we continually battle over what those meanings are, Martin Luther King Jr. couldn't even get a birthday until recently when the President of the United States of America, Ronald Reagan, in begrudgingly signing that legislation said, well, we'll see in 20 some odd years whether he's a communist or not. If we couldn't even agree that Martin Luther King Jr. was worthy of celebration of the ideals of this country, we know that when we look at Robert E. Lee or Stonewall Jackson, what we're arguing here is this is a manifestation of our ideals. These are the noble aspirations we have. So there are a lot of kids who are not going to ask, hey, why do we have a Robert E. Lee statue? They're going to say, you darn right we got that Robert E. Lee statue because that represents what we believe, and slavery was a value that we still hold fast to. Why don't we have statues of Huey P. Newton? Because why? In this, who was a Black Panther? Because this represents American sacred ground. The national memory is being not only tested, it's being reinforced. Again, I agree with the professor when we don't have lives at stake. When lives are at stake, we have to talk about what those values mean, what those memorials mean, and what we are celebrating in public space with public funds to reinforce the value of our civilization.
Professor, does it concern you who is taking the side of preservation right now, that you had white supremacists down there, that you have the president who seems intent on playing identity politics right now? Remember, this is a man who, when he was campaigning, said the Confederate flag should come down. Its time had passed. It should be put in the museum. Now, all of a sudden, he sees these monuments as a beautiful piece of history that you should not disturb. Do the motivations suggest that this is not as pure a principle as you're putting it out as?
I think it's very important who's advocating for keeping them. I see a difference between flags and monuments. I think Confederate flags obviously had to come down because they were, you know, that's something you have to keep putting up. The monuments are sort of there. I think we need to contextualize those monuments. I think counter monuments. I think it's a great idea to have a monument to somebody like Nat Turner, the slave rebel.
Yeah, but they're not.
Context matters.
But the point is, look, I agree with that. But the reason we're not putting, but yeah, context does matter. But who's providing the context? Kids who are looking at this monument without the advice of an adult and might not have it, and the adults might be on the side of the Confederacy. We need something deeper. We don't need participation trophies for the Civil War. We need to acknowledge what happened.
Gentlemen, there are two sides to this debate at least, and you presented them well and with decency, and that is appreciated, especially in this climate. Gentlemen, thank you. Poppy.
The death toll rising in the Spain terror attacks. We're going to take you live to the scene in Barcelona as police are trying to track down the driver behind that attack next.
The president has not yet been able to demonstrate the stability nor some of the competence that he needs to demonstrate in order to be successful. He also recently has not demonstrated that he understands the character of this nation.
All right, now, some are calling it a schism within the Republican Party, but it's not that extreme. And yet, to see Senator Bob Corker calling out the president yesterday, calling out his competency, that is unusual. Now it raises the question of how will the president respond, and will that make it worse?
Let's bring in our panel, CNN political analyst Ron Brownstein, political writer for The Atlantic, Molly Ball, and CNN political analyst David Drucker. So, Molly, I was looking at you while the Corker sound was playing and saying, wow, because as we were talking about before, this is a guy who the president considered maybe as VP, Secretary of State. Now, this is not a guy this is not a Lindsey Graham or a John McCain, right? What do you make of it? How big is that he questioned the president's competency and stability?
It's a big deal. I mean, on the one hand, it is a big deal because, as you say, Bob Corker is someone who has really tried to be on Trump's team.
Yeah.
On the other hand, those of us who cover the Congress know that Bob Corker is a truth teller. He is not someone who is going to toe the party line if he doesn't believe it. And that's part of the reason that he was able to, that's part of the reason, frankly, that he rejected the VP slot when he was considered for it, is he just didn't think that he could continue to be on Trump's team if it was going to require him to often, bury his relationship with the truth. So, The word in that statement that I still wonder about is the word yet, because so many Republicans are still saying he's not yet there. I think that word yet is going to disappear pretty soon as they realize, they come to the end of their rope and they realize it's not that it hasn't happened yet, it's that it's not going to happen.
Well, the measure is progress on the agenda, Ron Brownstein, is that while the president's inability to surrender the me to the we may suit his personal political aims of this new nationalism that he's pushing, it's hurting the ability to get anything done in Congress. It's a distraction, and it's been counterproductive for them, and that's going to frustrate, if nothing else.
That does frustrate, but I do think, Chris, the issue goes beyond that, because in many ways, the Republicans in Congress are in the exact same position as the business executives were, who have stampeded away from him after his remarks about Charlottesville. Because on the one hand, both groups largely agree with him on the economic agenda. Maybe on trade there are some differences, but by and large, they want less taxes and less regulation. And what the business groups were hoping was that business leaders were hoping was they could work with him on those issues and essentially keep out of the racial division and signaling that has really been essential to his message from day one. And I think that has been the posture as well of Republicans in Congress, particularly someone like Paul Ryan, who portrays himself as a disciple of Jack Kemp and has been certainly privately critical and at times publicly critical of President Trump, but essentially has bit his lip with Trump in office because they want to turn to things like taxes and deregulation. Now, the business leaders decided this week that was too high a price to pay, that standing next to Trump because of the social and racial views that he's been expressing was simply too high a price to pay for a kind of cooperation on the economic side. And you do wonder when Republicans in Congress, more Republicans in Congress, will make the same calculation, that even though they want to move ahead on this economic agenda, that ultimately they have to more clearly distance themselves from the president by name.
And Chris, I think that's going to happen when they get a signal from their voters that that's where the voters are headed. And if you talk to Republicans and you talk to their advisors, one of the things they're very cautious about, one of the things they sort of have a good understanding of, is that the Republican base, even though we've seen some cracks in the base when it comes to Trump, is still largely with him. For some of them, they'll never abandon him. For others that are skeptical and don't like the behavior,
David,
it's simply too soon.
Just one quick point, David. I mean, historically, every time members of Congress have stood up to a president of their own party, they have done so before the base has moved. The base simply does not move first. Whether it's William Fulbright holding the Vietnam hearings in 1966 when Lyndon Johnson still had overwhelming support among Democrats, or the Republicans voting to create the Watergate Committee in 73 when Nixon was still over 70% among Republicans. I think Nixon only went below 50% among Republicans once, even at the very end. The fact is that leaders have to lead if they believe that the national interest demands it. And you can go back through history and see that there have been occasions when leaders, particularly in the Senate, have concluded they need to challenge a president of their own party because the national interest demand is before their own voters get there, because they don't get there first.
And I think that we've started to see some of that. I do think, though, this is a little bit of a different era. The politics of today is a lot more tribal than it used to be, and I think that has made Republicans that have seen Trump survive scandals that would have sunk anybody else a lot more cautious and a lot more worried, especially since the Republican base in particular loathes its own party and loathes their leaders. We have, though, seen the differences that cropped up this week and a willingness to speak more forcefully against the president. This is something that has been building, and I think in September it could cause real problems as they try to tackle parts of the president's agenda and just things they have to do, like fund the government. There is such a lack of trust now between Republicans on the Hill and the White House. It is going to make it very difficult to get anything big done, let alone, in fact, it's going to make it difficult to get some of the small things done because they are so at odds with each other, and there is just no trust between the two, and you need that if you're going to take these big votes.
Molly, to David's point about tribalism, there's a really interesting new Monmouth poll out. 61% of those who approve of the president's sort of behavior and his presidency say there is nothing ever that he could ever do that would change their mind. And it reminds you of when he said, in jest, during the campaign, I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue, shoot someone, and people would stay loyal.
Yeah, well, but it's kind of ridiculous to say Trump's base supports Trump, because that's why they're Trump's base, right? And the problem for Trump is it is an increasingly shrinking group. The people who strongly support Trump are getting, that is a group that is getting smaller and smaller. It's a percentage of the electorate that's getting smaller and smaller. It has never been a majority of the electorate. A lot of Republicans who might have voted for Trump because they thought he was better than the alternative are moving from the strongly support into the only slightly support category, and that puts them, in danger of moving off the island altogether. So this analysis that Trump's base still supports him, yes, they're always going to be there, but that's not enough to win an election. And I do think you are going to see Republicans realizing that the problem is they're more loyal to Trump than they are to their local congressman or to the Republican Party. And so that really puts these members on an island.
We'll talk about in the next panel what he's doing and whether that speaks to his desire to expand, as we thought he would, or concentrate, which seems more likely.
Stocks plunging to their steepest one-day decline in months. The president likes to talk about the market up, now down, down, down. The president's comments about Charlottesville, are they rattling Wall Street? New details when New Day continues.
49 of those people, and for 25 years there wasn't a problem.
The problem? Historians have repeatedly said this never happened. This latest falsehood coming as President Trump's support base continues to crack over his defense of white supremacists.
We had a lot of people in that group that were there to innocently protest, and very legally protest, because, I don't know if you know, they had a permit.
The son of Fox CEO Rupert Murdoch, one of President Trump's closest informal advisors, denouncing the president in a scathing email, writing, "What we watched this last week in Charlottesville and the reaction to it by the President of the United States concern all of us as Americans and free people." The president's behavior also wearing thin with a growing list of his Republican allies. We're calling him out by name.
The president has not yet been able to demonstrate the stability nor some of the competence that he needs to demonstrate in order to be successful.
What we want to see from our president is clarity and moral authority. That moral authority is compromised.
Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell releasing a statement throwing his full support behind Senator Jeff Flake after President Trump went after the Arizona Republican and Senator Lindsey Graham on Twitter. The controversy also taking a toll on the president's bottom line and his business relationships, with 3 charities backing out of scheduled events at Mar-a-Lago. All of this coming as Mr. Trump ends plans for an advisory council on infrastructure. Despite the backlash, the president digging in, calling it foolish to remove statues of Confederate icons, lamenting the beauty that would be taken out of U.S. cities. The president had a much different view when asked about the removal of the Confederate flag during the campaign.
Think it needs to go?
I think it probably does, and I think they should put it in the museum, let it go.
Now, President Trump leaves Bedminster later this morning for a quick trip down to Camp David, only his second visit to the presidential retreat since taking office. But this is not a leisure trip. He'll be meeting with the National Security Council to talk about strategy in Afghanistan and South Asia. Vice President Mike Pence cut short his trip to Central America to return for the meeting. What's not clear is whether any other topics like North Korea will come up. Chris?
All right, Athena Jones, thank you very much for the reporting. President Trump in a war of words with leaders of his own party. What is all this infighting going to do to his ability to push through his agenda? We're going to discuss about that.
Council's collapsing. President Trump is pulling the plug now on an infrastructure advisory panel. That's right, 3 panels down now. The panel was created by an executive order in July. The White House was still courting members, and an official gave no reason for ending that process. But this news comes just a day after 2 other councils disbanded, the Manufacturing and the Strategy and Policy Forum. It's really been an exodus of business leaders prompting their collapse, a reaction to this president blaming both sides for violence in Charlottesville. Trump initially criticized those resignations, but then as the number grew, as there was really nobody left on them, he tweeted he was disbanding the councils. Its members included titans of business: Blackstone, J.P. Morgan, Pepsi, GM, Walmart. They employ hundreds of thousands of Americans. They're employers. They also have millions of customers. Breaking ties with Trump is an unprecedented rebuke to the business-friendly president. It could also hurt his economic agenda. He needs corporate America to help push for tax reform and infrastructure.
All right, ahead, two of the nation's top college basketball teams, Clemson and Oregon State, were harsh criticism for his response to the terror attack in Barcelona. His first comment following the tragedy coming in a tweet condemning the act, along with an offer to help. Well, he followed that up with a widely debunked story, tweeting, "Study what General Pershing of the United States did to terrorists when caught. It's no more radical Islamic terror for 35 years."
The president was referring to the supposed practice of shooting Muslims with bullets dipped in pig's blood. He told the same story in 2016 during a campaign rally. There's no evidence to suggest it ever happened. Another version of this, by the way, is burying someone who killed a Muslim who's been killed by American soldiers with a pig. The White House has not responded to a request for comment.
The president appears to be running out of allies in his party. Two Republican senators from the South, mind you, publicly questioning his fitness for office. Listen to Bob Corker of Tennessee, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who was on the short list for Secretary of State in the Trump administration.
The president has not yet been able to demonstrate the stability nor some of the competence that he needs to demonstrate in order to be successful.
Ability and competence. Tim Scott, the only black Republican in the Senate, says he simply cannot defend the indefensible.
His comments on Monday were strong. His comments on Tuesday started erasing the comments that were strong. What we want to see from our president is clarity and moral authority, and that moral authority is compromised when Tuesday happens. There's no question about that.
The president is busy counterpunching as usual, targeting two Republican senators who called him out, Lindsey Graham and Jeff Flake of Arizona, and seems to be endorsing Flake's Republican primary opponent, tweeting, "Great to see that Dr. Kelly Ward is running against Flake," Jeff Flake, original, "who is weak on borders, crime, and a non-factor in the Senate. Is toxic. The president will be in Arizona on Tuesday."
That tweet got the attention of Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. He says Flake has his full support. The president also going after Lindsey Graham, calling him a liar for accusing him of saying there is a moral equivalency between white supremacist groups and those who protest against them.
South Carolina senator responding to the president in part because of the manner in which you have handled the Charlottesville tragedy. You are now receiving praise from some of the most racist and hate-filled individuals and groups in our country. For the sake of our nation, as our president, please fix this.
Another CEO, corporate executive, is speaking out against the president's response to Charlottesville. James Murdoch, head of 21st Century Fox, son of informal Trump advisor Rupert Murdoch, is slamming President Trump in a letter obtained by CNN. James Murdoch writes that he's concerned over the president's reaction, saying, quote, "I can't even believe I have to write this. Standing up to Nazis is essential. There are no good Nazis," adding that Democrats, Republicans, and others must all agree on this. Murdoch also pledges $1 million to the Anti-Defamation League, an organization that fights anti-Semitism. Murdoch's criticism is notable due to his father's relationship with the president. According to sources at both the White House and 21st Century Fox, Rupert Murdoch speaks with the president several times a week. This letter comes after business leaders fled Trump's business councils, prompting the president to disband them.
President Trump taking a firm stand against the removal of Confederate monuments, calling it foolish, sad, and an assault on our history and American culture. The president, in a series of tweets lamenting efforts to take down our, quote, beautiful statues and monuments and the damage being done. Several cities have removed or plan to remove monuments honoring Confederate leaders. Last night, Lexington, Kentucky's council unanimously passed a resolution to remove 2 Confederate tributes.
And overnight, a statue of former Chief Justice Roger Taney was removed from the grounds of the Maryland State House. Taney delivered the majority opinion in the 1857 Dred Scott case, which found slaves were not citizens of the United States.
3 of the nation's most respected and widely read magazines are taking on President Trump with a powerful cover of their own using artwork. The New Yorker and The Economist both featuring the president with images of the KKK's ominous white hood. The Economist cover also has a tagline that reads, "Donald Trump is politically inept, morally barren, and temperamentally unfit for office." Time magazine, A more direct approach with 3 words, hate in America, and the flag certainly appears to be a Nazi salute.
3 powerful images all dropping at the same. All right, 50 minutes past the hour. Big sell-off on Wall Street. The stock market notching its biggest.
Captain's mast held today.
All right, Marine Corps investigators trying to
talking about the president.
When it comes to the Klan, when it comes to the Nazis and white supremacists, they are unambiguously evil. They're racist, they're bigots, and as we saw tragically in Charlottesville, far too often, Nazis and Klansmen have resorted to violence and murder. The First Amendment protects free speech, even hateful speech, but it only protects our rights to speak peaceably, not to carry out acts of violence, not to carry out murder. And when you do see hateful, racist, bigoted speech personified by Nazis and Klansmen, I believe all of us have a moral obligation to call it out unequivocally.
Senator Cruz, what was your reaction when you heard what the president said?
You know, there are plenty of folks providing day-to-day running commentary on the president's various comments, on the president's various tweets, and I feel confident that our good friends in the media will continue to provide that commentary. I'm going to leave that to others, but I am going to focus on addressing the issues of the day. And in the hours that followed, particularly the horrific scene that all of us have seen of that young man driving the car into the crowd and murdering a young woman, injuring a number of others, that was an act of domestic terrorism. And
okay, so Senator Cruz there didn't call the president out by name, but somebody who did, Gloria, somebody did, Senator Tim Scott, the only African-American Republican in the U.S. Senate, saying that Trump's moral authority is compromised. So add Senator Scott to the growing list of Republicans who are calling out the president.
Right, and we know that it was slow to start, but you had Senator Corker today questioning the president's stability and competence. And then you have Senator Tim Scott, a friend of the president's, saying, I'm not going to defend the indefensible. And he said that while the comments on Monday were strong, he said that Tuesday started erasing those comments, and that what we want to see is clarity and moral authority. You know, you are hearing this over and over again. And he said, and that moral authority is compromised when Tuesday happened.
Gloria, thank you so much.
Sure.
There has been so much just today alone in some of these Republicans calling out the president's tweet that has been debunked on General Pershing, and also this terror attack in Barcelona, latest on that, 12 dead, more than 80 hurt. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Jake Tapper in Washington. I'm Brooke Baldwin. Thank you so much for being with me for the last 2 hours. Special coverage continues with Jake right now. We'll do whatever we can to help you. And then this. Study what General Pershing of the United States did to terrorists when caught. There was no more radical Islamic terror for 35 years. So now you have the commander-in-chief telling people to study a military incident that historians have debunked as a myth. A myth. Tim Naftali, presidential historian. What was he thinking with this tweet?
Oh, I don't, believe me, Brooke, don't ask me what the president's thinking when he's tweeting, except it's clear that at times he tweets out of anger. You know, it's a little bit surprising, to put it mildly, that a president would want to praise the actions of an American leader in what was an American colony. America had this moment of imperialism, which then America turned its back on. Most famously by Franklin Roosevelt, who, with a reluctant Winston Churchill, pushed for something called the Atlantic Charter that put the United States on the side of anti-imperialism. why President Trump would want to associate with anything done by the United States in its colony is surprising, except that President Trump doesn't know a lot about history. We saw this with the Confederate statues. This is a moment for empathy. I'm not asking people to go, I'm a historian, so of course I want people to read history, but this is a moment of empathy. In Barcelona, we saw one manifestation of hate. In Charlottesville, we saw another manifestation of hate. Whatever the ideology or motivation behind it, hate is hate. And this is a time for a president, rather than stoking the fires of hate, should be thoughtful about how you knit people together. This tweet about Pershing will be debunked. But what makes it important
has been debunked
is that it says the president is provoking people. Rather than saying to Americans, we must fight hate in all of its manifestations.
Which has been the theme, provoking, whether it was from Trump Tower, I hear you, or this tweet. Not to mention, you study the history, but even present time, ISIS infiltrating the Philippines currently. So there's that. Oh. Crystal, go ahead, quickly. Tim, go ahead.
I was just going to say that Islamicist or neo-Nazi hate, it doesn't matter how you describe it. It's hate.
Hate is hate.
And it's something that as human beings, we must unite against. And the president's tweet, his tweet regarding Barcelona was helpful, but his tweet regarding Pershing wasn't at all.
Tim, thank you. Tim Naftali. Crystal Liza, you're next on this. Looking at your face, reacting to, I know, this tweet. What did you think at first?
Well, Tim Naftali's got the history piece of it obviously nailed down. I mean, this is something that Trump has said before, has been debunked before by historians, by people in the moment when he said it before. But it's something he likes because he likes this idea of past administrations have been too politically correct to be tough enough. Remember, Brooke, this is a president who, as a candidate, said waterboarding will be the least of what I'll do as it relates to torture of people captured. So, I mean, this is part of the tough guy image that he likes to promote. It's also, I heard you guys use the word...
But hang on, tough guy, according to the myth, I mean, basically he's endorsing mass murder.
Yeah, but he's saying, I mean, I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just saying that Donald Trump's belief is that these people deserve more and worse than they are getting when he speaks of ISIS, and that the reason that they continue to exist is because of not rough enough treatment. Any number of times on the campaign trail, he talked about keeping people in cages and beheading people and their tactics. Now, what people will tell you, what people like John McCain, who actually have been tortured and in a prison camp, will tell you is, and I heard Tim saying this, you know, torture, hate does not beget love. Torture does not beget, you know, anything other than more negativity. That is what people far smarter and more experienced than me will tell you when you talk about an eye for an eye in that regard. But that is his belief. That is something he has said time and time again. And one other thing, sorry, Brooke, you guys were talking about provocation and to provoke. Time and again, I think I come back to this. Donald Trump, if there is a through line through his life, a lot of people say, oh, he's a salesman, he's a marketer. Those things are true. But he's also a provocateur. That's someone he's been his whole life, someone willing to sort of say and do things that are either not true or of questionable truth, or he doesn't know if they're true or not, to provoke reaction. The idea that he would change as president, I think, was always a little bit of a fantasy that people had hoped, but has been proven out, whether it's Charlottesville, whether it's this Pershing tweet, whether it's 90 other things I could point to in the last 2 months, that he, at his root, he is a provocateur. That's what he does. Now, a provocateur
so you're saying
acting presidential is a dangerous thing.
Acting presidential, too high of a bar?
Well, remember, this is the president who said he's, quote, modern day presidential. Now, he never defined that. But what I think he means there is, I don't know that Trump believes everything that he says on a daily basis. I think a lot of it is that he takes positions that are provocative, number one, and number two, in opposition to things or people he doesn't agree with. So If Democrats say X, he will say Y. If the media says you didn't go far, well, frankly, I'm not going to play into that. If the media, virtually every Republican elected official, the generals, the military say your comments about Charlottesville were misleading, inappropriate at best, he then doubles down on it. Not necessarily because I think he believes it, but because the people he doesn't like say he's wrong.
Sure. You just gave me the opening to ask you about Bob Corker, right? This is the other headline involving the president. So just into CNN, as the president is, defiant over his controversial remarks about the violence in Charlottesville, harsh words from this high-profile Republican senator. Again, this is a man that we've seen the president with, who was on the short list for Secretary of State. This is a Republican senator from Tennessee, Bob Corker, and so this is what he has just told reporters. I'm going to quote him. I do think there needs to be radical changes. The president has not yet been able to demonstrate the stability nor some of the competence that he needs to be successful. He goes on, helping inspire divisions because it generates support from your political base is not a formula for causing our nation to advance, our nation to overcome the many issues we have to deal with right now. He also recently has not demonstrated he understands the character of this nation. He has not demonstrated that he understands what has made this nation great, what it is today, and he's got to demonstrate the characteristics of a president who understands that people have to understand. We should hope that he aspires, that he does some self-reflection, that he does what is necessary to demonstrate stability, to demonstrate competence, to demonstrate that he understands the character of our nation and works daily to bring out the best of the people in our nation. If that is not powerful and damning of the president of the United States, I don't know what is.
Yeah, Brooke, I highlighted.
Speaking of being presidential.
I highlight a couple things. One, I do think it's important. You mentioned it, but it bears repeating. Bob Corker is someone that Donald Trump sought to bring in, right? Someone that he sought his guidance and counsel, someone who's in the mix for Secretary of State. So this is not Lindsey Graham or John McCain, who have been never fans of Trump or never someone that Trump consulted with. Number two, the use of competence twice in that you just read, and stability. I do think there are concerns among Republican senators that this is the worry that Donald Trump may not be looking out for them is kind of out the window. The worry that Donald Trump is unaware of the damage he is doing is now front and center. Frankly, there should be more statements like the one from Bob Corker, from other senators, from other members of Congress.
Why do you think there aren't? Why do you think there aren't, Chris?
Because they're two things. One, and they tie together. One, because they are afraid of Donald Trump's political base. Two, because they don't want to wade into this, that they view it as a lose-lose situation politically. If they wade into it, they don't get any credit from the base, and what do they gain on the upside? What I would say, what you gain on the upside is, and Tim spoke, I did a Q&A with Tim yesterday where he was great on and I'd urge people to read, on talking about Trump's claims about the Confederacy and about the Lee statue